Okay, so what do Herman Melville's masterpiece Moby Dick, an ancient New England clam bake, and a 1950s flash-frozen TV dinner actually have in common? On the surface, you'd probably say absolutely nothing, but if we look a little closer, they are the literal and literary ingredients of the American identity. In this explainer, we're going to explore exactly how the evolution of what Americans consume for sustenance perfectly mirrors what they consume for stories. Welcome to the Plates and Pages of the American Experiment.
Our journey today traces 5 distinct eras. We've got native roots and traditions, colonial survival and synthesis, 19th century farms and philosophies, realism, war and industry, and finally, modern tastes and tales.
Take a look at this timeline. It lays out a fantastic 400-plus-year roadmap for us, showing how the evolution of what Americans put on their plates directly mirrors what they put on their pages. We're going to see how, century by century, shifts in agriculture and industry provoke literally identical shifts in philosophy and literature.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Native Roots and Traditions, Deep Connections to the Land.
So in their agriculture, Native American tribes practiced a system known as the Three Sisters. The careful companion planting of maize, beans, and squash, which sustained their communities. Now look at how this physical triad is completely mirrored in their literature. The rich oral traditions, creation stories, and folk tales relied heavily on structured, culturally significant numbers. For instance, the number 4 was frequently repeated to represent the cardinal directions, and the number 7 represented those directions, plus skyward, earthward, and center. So both their farming and their storytelling were deeply rooted in a structured, sacred geometry tied directly to the earth.
And you've got to appreciate the sheer ingenuity of early Native American cooking methods here, specifically the stone boiling and steaming processes. Tribes in the Northeast would heat rocks in a pit fire, layer them with seaweed or corn husks, and basically steam fish, shellfish, and vegetables right there. It was a hyper-localized culinary tradition that early colonists would later adopt, adapt, and famously call a clam bake. The land completely dictated the cooking method, just as it dictated the culture.
Moving right along to Section 2, Colonial Survival and Synthesis, a clash of two worlds.
Picture this messy collision phase. Early colonists essentially had to rewrite both their recipes and their identities from scratch. They arrived expecting to grow English wheat and read British literature, but wheat was almost impossible to grow in places like early New England. They were forced to substitute it with native cornmeal, creating things like Johnny cakes. And simultaneously, their literature shifted right away from British traditions to uniquely American survival narratives and patriotic writings. Just as they forged a new diet to survive, they forged a new independent mindset, eventually producing foundational Enlightenment texts like Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. But, change is hard. Despite adopting to the land, a lot of folks stubbornly clung to their old world origins. We can see this tension perfectly captured in this frankly hilarious 1747 quote from Hannah Gloss's popular cookbook. She flagrantly dismisses French cuisine as an odd jumble of trash, urging her readers not to be imposed on by a French booby. It really shows that even as an American identity was bubbling up, there was this fierce defensive pride in maintaining English cultural roots, right there in the kitchen.
Which brings us to Section 3, 19th century farms and philosophies, the era of self-reliance.
As the nation expanded, literature reacted with Transcendentalism. This intellectual movement was built entirely on the belief in the inherent goodness of people and nature, and the idea that true self-reliance unlocks that goodness. It's an era perfectly embodied by Henry David Thoreau's book Walden, which, if you think about it, is essentially a philosophical diary reflecting on the virtues of independent living, far away from the corrupting influence of society.
And that exact same philosophy of self-reliance, it built its way directly into the culinary world. The 19th century farmhouse diet was incredibly hearty, localized, and farm-driven. Families grew what they ate and ate what they grew. You had thick pork porridge and cornmeal, known as pawnhouse among German settlers in Indiana. You had fried chicken, seasonal fruit preservation, turning apples into apple butter, and honestly my personal favorite detail, pie served up to 3 times a day. They were totally self-sustaining, quite literally eating the fruits of their own independent labor.
Actually, scratch that sunny optimism for a second, because it wasn't all apple butter and sunshine. This deep isolation had a dark side, too. Writers like Washington Irving and Edgar Allan Poe used the American Gothic movement to express the deep frontier anxiety and fear of the unknown that lurked just beyond the safe, lit borders of the farmland. Tales like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow were the literary equivalent of a dark, bitter root, a direct counterreaction to the bright, hopeful Transcendentalist movement.
That takes us into Section 4,
Realism, war, and industry. Digesting trauma and technology.
Following the Civil War, we see a massive cultural pivot. In literature, there's the rise of literary realism and naturalism. Writers like Mark Twain and Stephen Crane actively stripped away the romantic illusions of the past, presenting life exactly as it was, often harsh, right? Often indifferent. Simultaneously, over in cuisine, rapid urbanization meant urban diets were stripped of their foreign roots. City dwellers crammed into tiny kitchenettes, pivoted away from fresh farm food to industrially produced convenience. We're talking canned tomato bisque, pasteurized milk in glass bottles, and imported cold cuts from city delicatessens. Romance was out. Gritty reality and industrial efficiency were officially in.
Now, this era was also defined by a rising skepticism. Just as naturalistic literature began to question the morality of the universe, muckraking journalists began to question the morality of the food industry. They exposed the hidden, often gross dangers of heavily processed foods, which directly led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, basically the foundation of modern food safety. We also start seeing science entering the kitchen. Researchers discovered vitamins, which led to everyday staples like bread and milk being artificially fortified to protect public health.
Then, following the devastating shock of the First World War, this overarching skepticism morphed into American modernism. Expatriate writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, the folks often called the Lost Generation, really captured a profound loss of direction. The world had become completely mechanized, both in its ability to produce food on a massive scale, and tragically, its ability to wage war on a massive scale. The literature of this time is fragmented, questioning, and deeply scarred by modern trauma.
Finally, we hit Section 5, Modern Tastes and Tales, the Post-War Revolution.
Okay, nothing screams modern American convenience quite like the TV dinner. I mean, it is a highly processed, flash-frozen marvel that completely redefined how families prepared and consumed meals. Engineered in a factory, packaged in aluminum, and specifically designed to be eaten while staring at a screen, the TV dinner was the ultimate symbol of post-war suburban conformity and technological triumph. The daily struggle for survival was officially over. The era of ultimate convenience had arrived.
But here is the fascinating twist. While kitchens happily embraced this mass-produced conformity, the literary world fiercely rebelled against it. Contemporary and postmodern literature exploded with subversive, countercultural themes. The Beat generation of the 1950s rejected suburban values entirely. As obscenity laws loosened up, writers started speaking frankly about taboo subjects. Postmodernism brought us unreliable narrators and fractured timelines to explicitly critique the shiny, mass-produced culture of America itself. So while the fridge was full of uniform products, the bookshelf was wild, unpredictable, and loudly dissenting.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've seen how centuries of diet and literature reflect the changing American soul, from the Three Sisters and sacred creation myths, to clam bakes and colonial survival, all the way up to TV dinners and postmodern rebellion. So I leave you with this final provocative thought. If future historians looked closely at your bookshelf and your refrigerator right now, what story would they tell about you? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.